back to our discussion of the history of ideas here in World History 2. Today's topic is we're going to be dealing with the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is very much the culmination of many of the ideas that we've been discussing about the Enlightenment and what happens when not only they begin to put the Enlightenment ideas into practice, but it begins to kind of escape from the bottom. So revolution is going to be one of the major themes that we're going to be talking about here really in the second half of the history of the world. And so we're going to explore this in several different contexts. But not only are we going to be dealing with the French Revolution, but also the giant sort of worldwide war that it is going to spawn. Essentially, there's going to be like a 22-year period of almost uninterrupted warfare. So there's going to be military history wrapped up in this. We're going to get dictators like Napoleon Bonaparte, and we'll talk about what happens as a result of all of this. But the place to really get started is going to be actually the American Revolution, which is going to help feed into the French Revolution. Now, for those of you who have never heard of America or what's going on, it would behoove us to do a little bit of backstory on these people and what they were doing. By the 1770s, 13 of Britain's North American colonies had a significant bellyful of what they regarded as the English Parliament's interference with their, meaning the Americans' internal affairs. Taxation, regulation of trade, things like that. They felt that the king's government, initially it was just the king's ministers, were becoming increasingly autocratic, and what they felt were very illiberal modes of government. They were not being represented fairly in the government that supposedly was going to represent them. So eventually this is going to culminate into some fighting that's going to start in 1775 between the Americans and the British Army. And it's all going to come to a head here on July 4th, 1776, when the United States of America is going to issue the Declaration of Independence. And just as a sort of a side note, if you're very interested in how to write an argumentative paper, the Declaration of Independence is kind of one of the best models that you could use for yourself. Now, the document itself is very much the Enlightenment put on paper. It spelled out the various forms of freedom. It can get distilled down into three basic ones: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That term, pursuit of happiness, has evolved some over the course of the centuries. We would look at this as, oh, you get to wander around and sort of do whatever makes you happy, but they regarded this more in kind of economic terms, that whatever job you wanted to have, whatever business you wanted to pursue, as long as you didn't hurt anybody, you should be able to do this, and they felt that Parliament wasn't allowing them to do this. They felt that these rights and these liberties were fundamental to all people, and they argued that people were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which is rights that cannot be taken away. So they felt that this was something that went beyond humanity, that just by the process of special creation that humans have this. And so, therefore, since England's government had broken that covenant, had trampled on this, they felt that they had the right to do away with Britain's governmental control over them, and they were going to then create a new government that, at least they hoped, would preserve those rights and liberties, those fundamentals of what it was to be human. Now, if you poke through this, the language, the argumentative style, the themes are all that of the European Enlightenment. In many ways, Locke is going to get transported in many ways just directly over ideas that Adam Smith is discussing in his book that very same year are just, they're going to come up. So none of this was something that the founders of the United States just kind of pulled out of thin air. Hey, I got some great ideas. This is, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Hey, I really like that. No, this is all going to be borrowed and in some cases just outright copied. Many of the ideas of the European Enlightenment that the Americans are going to use themselves. And what you're going to see is during the early days of the American Revolution, a lot of very liberal-minded Europeans are going to volunteer to come over and to help America achieve these political goals, because in them they say, oh, well, yeah, the ideas that we're talking about here in Europe, the Americans are actually doing. So there they are. We got our guys here in Philadelphia in 1776, and they're presenting the final draft of what is eventually going to be issued on July 4th of 1776. Here's a fair copy of what this is. This isn't the original, which is pretty faded and kind of hard to look at. So how does this influence what's going on around the world? All right. By 1777, France sees that the third year of the war between the Americans and the British is going along pretty well, and sees an opportunity to further its own national interests, and that's to strike back at Britain. Britain had, throughout much of the 1700s, really pummeled France through a series of colonial wars, the most recent being the 7 Years' War, and France is seeing the opportunity to really get back at Britain. And they enter the war on the United States' side. Again, you should not mistake the actions here of France's monarchy as, oh, we love the Americans because we love freedom and liberty. No, okay? This is strictly a war of national convenience for France. They want to smack back at England and poke them in the eye, and the American cause is a good enough excuse for them. One of the problems, of course, that France is staring in the face is the fact that France has very little disposable income in order to wage this war. They have a pretty inefficient government. Their cash reserves are still pretty depleted from previous engagements with Britain, so that's going to be a factor later on. Now, at this point, all right, many more Europeans are ever increasingly going to cross the Atlantic to help out with the Americans because now it becomes part of their national policy. Some French people that have come over and volunteered to go and help the Americans are backed up by the fact that France is now saying, yes, we're going to actively go and assist these Americans. And what's going to happen is, when these Europeans come across, they're going to serve side by side with people like George Washington, with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, James Monroe. They're going to be rubbing shoulders with these people. In many cases, they will strike up lifetime friendships with these men. They're going to correspond back and forth. They're going to exchange ideas, and they're going to see America and its society and how it's putting these Enlightenment ideas into action. After the American victory, after Yorktown in 1782, these people are going to return home for the most part. And they are going to bring their bodies back to Europe, but they're also going to bring back their ideas. The ideas and the experiences of a democratic society living out the ideas of the Enlightenment. It has to be pretty exciting stuff when you talk about an idea. We could try this, and your society is not really changing around you, and you go to some place that they're actually doing it, right? So what this did, this episode, is it really further fueled a lot of these liberal ideas in Europe because they take them out of the realm of theory and it puts them into the realm of practice. And so here you can see British soldiers are surrendering to George Washington and his dark blue clad American officers, and then you have this one guy in a cream colored outfit, and this is the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a Frenchman and played an integral role in helping Washington and his army defeat the French. Lafayette, of course, would go back over to France and become one of the major proponents of the French Revolution once it begins to take place. Well, this is all going to come to a head in 1789 here in France. And this collapse that takes place in France is the product of decades of deterioration within the French government, French society, on an intellectual level, an economic level, a political level, a governmental level. So this is not something that just happens one afternoon because bread gets to be too expensive in Paris. It has been building for a long time. So we've got to look at how French society is put together here in the 18th century. First of all, politically, society was divided into these three groups, and these were called the estates. So you got three. You got 1, 2, and 3. Now, the first estate was the clergy. These are representatives of the French members of the Roman Catholic faith. These people within France, special laws and special rules applied to the French clergy. And over the course of time, especially throughout the medieval period, when one of the things that you could do to keep the church happy was give them stuff, and of course the best stuff to wind up with was land, by this point they owned 10% of the land and essentially paid no taxes, because they're the church who would dare to tax God. So the second estate was the nobility. These are the people that were born to the wealthy, landed elites, and do this, Baron so-and-so, etc. Like these guys. Now they're privileged in the military. They have access to the officer corps pretty easily. So they've got ways to advance themselves in society that way. They are privileged in business because the people who make the laws and run the government are going to give them favor. And of course, they themselves are the government as a result of that. So these are the people that are born into these situations, and essentially they pay very limited taxes as well. Now the third estate was everybody else, and this is, some estimates have it as high as something like 98% of the population. Maybe a little bit lower, but it's definitely something like 90% of the population is the third estate, right? Now, peasants, people that were working people out in the fields, sort of workaday folks, they had to pay the nobles for common services. So the nobles were able to leverage their position in society to make sure that everybody had to pay them for the basic things that you needed. Bridges, roads, milling services, breweries, they had their finger in kind of every pot, and they always wound up making the money off of all these other people. The problem with this was not really from the people who were at the very bottom of society, but it was the rising middle class. These people, the bourgeoisie, they were the merchant class. And through their own hard work and enterprise in an ever-increasingly capitalistic world, they were making money. And there were more and more of them because of the increasing worldwide markets that France had access to. And these guys looked a lot like the upper class. They looked a lot like the nobility. They had money, they had power, and influence in society, but because they weren't born into the right families, they were excluded from political power by the nobles. Now, of course, they want to get that political power to make sure that they can maintain their business interests for what they're doing under these mercantile operations. But no, they're denying it. No, you can't have this. So this is where the friction is actually going to be. It's not so much for people on the very bottom of society, but people who are kind of at the top of the bottom, if you can take my meaning. And this is a little political cartoon that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on, right? Revel du tiers état, right? Which is the rise of the third estate. So you've got our two estates. The first estate, you've got a clergyman here, and our second estate, right? We've got a nobleman. In this case, he's clad in his army officer's uniform, and they are shocked to see that our average Frenchman now has broken the shackles off of him, and he's reaching for both the sword and the musket, and so he's going to exact his revenge on these guys. So that's the overall kind of background of what French society and why it's got these political and government and social problems and up to 1789. But when we get to the specific sequence of events, we're going to see that it's actually going to be a series of failures that expose these inherent inequalities and cause the cracks to get wider. All right? France, as I mentioned previously, had fought a series of very expensive, often losing wars throughout the 1700s, and this, of course, had depleted France's treasury. You got to have money in order to make things work, and of course, in order to make good these shortfalls, the system of taxation is going to be taking more and more money out of the private economy to go towards the government. Now, the taxation system itself was actually pretty corrupt. The central government say, okay, we need tax money to come in, and while all of us kind of grit our teeth, taxes are pretty awful, we also all mostly understand, okay, taxation, it's part of life. You have to pay, for the common services that need to take place for all of us. But the problem with this is the central government is telling, all of these intermediaries to go out and tax the people. They're taking the taxes, and more of it is winding up in their own pockets. Now, it's the privileged class, these privileged bureaucrats that come from the most part, the nobility, that are using the opportunity to line their own pockets with the public money. In fact, coming out of the medieval era, that's why you wanted one of these tax jobs. It wasn't because the taxation job was a whole lot of fun. You got to go tell people they owe the government money, right? And that's not a whole lot of fun. And then you're counting money, and you're writing checks, and you're transferring funds, and I don't know, maybe you're into that kind of stuff. But for the most part, the job itself isn't all that great, but it's an opportunity to really make yourself rich. That's why you want these kinds of gigs, all right? So ever increasingly, the government's saying, well, we're not getting a lot of the money that we thought we were getting, and so they increase the taxes. So the people are paying more, but the central government isn't necessarily receiving more. We're going to see, due to a lack of monetary control, and this happens in a lot of governments that don't have monetary control, we're going to see a rise in inflation in prices. The government can't control it because it's not actually controlling the money supply. A lot of the control is out of control due to the corruption of people within the government. This eventually is going to reach epic proportions when the people of Paris, who, they're not farmers, okay, they live in the city, they have to go to the store and they have to buy food. So inflation hits them particularly hard. When you show up and you can't afford bread, there's going to be riots. And that's what's going to happen here in 1788. There's going to be a bread riot in Paris because you can't get enough to eat. And they're going to flip out. And what are you going to do? It's not like you can just sort of grow potatoes in your backyard when you don't have a backyard, right? And especially not when you're hungry that day. Now, through much of this period, because again, as I mentioned, this doesn't all happen in the span of a week, all right? Louis XVI, the monarch, he's actually pretty disinterested in doing government stuff. He's interested in looking fancy and riding around and, picking up chicks in his fancy, wagon or whatever. He's being the king. The message kind of finally begins to get through to him, and he tries a number of series of reforms to the bureaucracy. But by this point, these corrupt bureaucrats were so heavily entrenched in their jobs, and they had diffused so much of this absolutist power throughout France that they're able to kind of politically dig in their heels, and they're, no, this is how things are. You can't take away the privileged power of the nobility. You can't do this. So Louis is forced to do what he thought would be the one remaining political sort of saber that he could use to kind of cut this power away from these guys, and that was to convene the Estates General. And this is something that hadn't happened in France since the end of the 100 Years' War, the medieval period, because they had sort of largely consigned this power to the French monarch, and so you just kind of run it yourself. The idea behind this is where you would have this meeting of the three estates. The king is going to go in, at least he hopes, and he says, okay, I need the political authority to make these big changes to the bureaucracy. We've got to fix what's going on. And since once he gets that stamp, that imprimatur from the Estates General, he'll feel that he'll have the political oomph to get what he needs done. That's what he hopes is going to happen. What actually happens is something else. This is Louis XVI. How you see the wealth, the splendor, really kind of the extravagance of the office of the King of France by this point. You'll also notice that his head at this point is still conveniently attached to his body. So, what is actually going to take place at the Estates General is not really what Louis wants at all. So, representatives of the three estates, they meet in Versailles in 1789. Immediately, the Third Estate clamors for a more equal distribution of the votes because they say, listen, we represent most of French society, and yet we only have 1/3 of the vote. Because the way that the vote was done was you would say, okay, we're going to talk about this motion, or we're going to talk about this, this idea, or whether or not we're going to do it. And then within each estate, they would vote, and they would determine, okay, what does the first estate vote for, yes or no? If most of them voted yes, then that's one vote for yes. And then the second estate, same thing, so you'd have 2 votes. And then the third estate, 1 vote. So it didn't matter how many guys were in the chamber, each estate only got 1 vote. The third estate said this is not fair, we should have more votes, we should have more representatives. So they kind of compromised, but not really. They said, okay, the third estate can have double the delegates. But we're still not going to do the votes by head. We're going to do this by estate. So yeah, they went from 300 delegates to 600 delegates, but they still only had 1 vote. They just had more people to argue with. So the nobles were the ones that really blocked the move, and they made sure that the clergy voted with them because, for the most part, the clergy were the nobles. This is how you got into the church, into high positions of the church. You came from one of the noble families, and so, all right. The third decided to reform France itself, and they began meeting just amongst themselves, and they referred to themselves as the National Assembly. They began holding these meetings all on their own, and they began coming up with, what are all these Enlightenment kind of reforms that we can put into place? They understood that they were running afoul of what the king had really called them there to do, but they had their own little meeting hall, and one day they showed up, and the meeting hall was locked. And they figured, well, this is the king. He's trying to keep us from doing our job. And they get worked up and all fly off the handle. They meet in a tennis court, and they came to the ultimate conclusion that, all right, France needs a constitution. France needs a written set of rules that's not arbitrary, that some king can't wake up one day and decide, you know what we've been doing? Yeah, forget all that. We're going to do something else. He said, no. They said, no, we need limited government. We need a constitution. And they're going to come up with a new one. And so they took this oath. It's called the tennis court oath where they do this. All right. Now, Louis had been kind of blithely watching this develop, and he hadn't really weighed in because he figured that these people did have some points about why they were so upset about what was going on, but he really hadn't done a whole lot to stop this. Now he decided, okay, things are getting out of hand. When I talk about limiting the overall government, that means limiting me. No, I don't think so. Louis now at this point he sides with the nobility. These guys, these third estate guys, have to be controlled and possibly even suppressed. He mobilizes troops in Paris to stop the reforms because many people from the Third Estate, from the National Assembly, said, okay, we're the legitimate government now, France. You guys have to do what we say. So Louis sends in the troops and says, okay, no, they're not the government. I'm the government, all right? The idea that Louis had was sending troops to Paris would put the population in Paris, which was pretty reform-minded. This was the hotbed of the Enlightenment. They're sort of pro-Enlightenment. He had hoped that this would sort of frighten these people. The thought of guys with guns coming in and blowing the place up is going to cause them to kind of shrink back and realize, okay, we don't really want to do this. Instead, the effect was to galvanize public support. It really inflamed public passions. Oh, Louis said in the army, oh, they're going to try to kill us. And so they began to assemble together and figure out, okay, what are we going to do if we have to fight? Right? So here are some scenes of this, right? This is the meeting of the States General. You get the first estate, and then you get the second estate, and then you can see that they've given the third here on the one side. Extra delegates, but not extra votes with this. When we get to 1789, we're going to see another spike in bread prices until eventually we have another bread riot. And you're going to have people in the streets, and they're mad because they can't afford to eat. And that we can understand. So this riot, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the high-minded political attitudes of whether or not you want a constitution or not, spreads amongst the general population. And the violence is going to get out of hand. And the king's troops that then are sent into the city to try to quell this riot, becomes pretty obvious fairly early on that they can't. That this violence is too widespread, it's too out of control. And then as it went on, in many cases they refused. They would not stop the violence, and a lot of these guys are actually going to cross over and become members of the revolution as well. So there's a lot of confusing fighting back and forth here in France. The revolutionaries themselves are going to attack the Bastille on July 14th. The Bastille was an armory and a prison for especially political prisoners. There weren't, when you listen to the French today, they talk about it, oh, the prisoners there, this was the symbol of us and the repressive regime of Louis. Yeah, that's true, but mainly they wanted the guns that were in there. It was an important strategic objective for the revolutionaries. But again, what it was and what it came to mean is that the storming of the Bastille is the symbol of the people overcoming sort of royal despotism of that. And so July 14th is sort of like France's Independence Day, if you want to make an American kind of analogy as a result of that. Well, the violence at this point had been largely confined to Paris itself, but it begins to spread outward to the outlying cities and even the countryside all over France as more and more people begin to absorb these ideas of what's going on in the capital, and they begin to pick up steam themselves. Louis realized that his authority was ever increasingly getting smaller and smaller, and as a result of the fact that Louis can't make a whole lot happen on the street, the National Assembly is the de facto government now of France, and they're able to proceed with essentially whatever they want to do. So here's the Bastille, and here's this confusing mob of revolutionaries as they're pushing their way in, and then you got the king's troops in the background, and so you're going to have this fighting that's going to take place around here. So the violence has started, and is not going to soon end. The National Assembly now, though, feels like it has the ability that can do some serious reform that they feel is necessary. They abolished all aristocratic and clerical privileges. You and I today, we might refer to this as equality before the law, meaning that all citizens, regardless of to whom you were born, you're all equal. You're all equal before the law. Nobody gets any special breaks from the government. They also stated that men were essentially free, that one of their fundamental statuses is that they're all free people, and that they are equal in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Just like the Americans had borrowed pretty heavily from European thoughts of the Enlightenment, the French here are going to borrow pretty heavily from the American Revolution and the Enlightenment ideas, and they promised three prongs of liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Not exactly life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but basically the same kind of thing, right? Prices, though, continue to rise. There's not a good fiscal control policy for this, which is not surprising given the fact you got a lot of riots in the streets of Paris. Who is actually in charge of the central policy-making machinery of the state? We don't really know, right? And this is going to cause another riot, in this case particularly women, who for the most part are doing the shopping for their families, and so they're the ones that the prices are going to impact directly, at least initially. And these women are going to march on Versailles. Versailles is a short little, well, not terribly short, but I mean it's within walking distance of Paris. And they're going to head out there, and they're going to capture Louis. I'm sure if you're Louis XVI and you see a whole army of babes coming to your house, the first thought is not, revolution, hey, party at Versailles. Well, it turns out that this kind of party didn't work out in Louis's favor. So they're going to grab the king, and they're going to haul him off, and they're going to take him back to Paris, and he is then their prisoner. We're going to see that a number of other riots break out in other cities in the fall of 1789. The Assembly is going to do what it promised to do, and that is to produce a constitution. Now, the constitution that they produce isn't necessarily ones that probably Americans, either then or now, would be terribly comfortable with. It produced a constitutional monarchy. Okay? It didn't get rid of the idea that you had a king, but it did say, okay, you can't do everything that you feel like. It restricted the king's power, and it gave a lot of power to the elected legislature. But who is it that's going to be in the legislature? Well, you had to have a property requirement, meaning you had to have enough money in order to be able to vote. Basically, if you were upper middle class or higher, you would be able to vote for members of the national legislature. One of the things that these guys in the National Assembly fear, because you remember they're the bourgeoisie for the most part, they're the upper middle class, they didn't want the thought of their money being voted by the poor people to themselves. So they didn't want these people to vote. So this is an important distinction. All right? Now, as news of this begins to filter down, more and more radical groups, people who aren't the kind of middle of the road kind of thought processes that the bourgeoisie are going to have, these are more radical people that want to see huge changes and not necessarily the same kind of changes that the bourgeoisie are promising. These are some really, really radical groups. The most important for our story are going to be these guys, the Jacobins. And they want to depose the king. They want to get rid of the whole idea of monarchy. No, we should get rid of the king. We don't need a monarch at all. More importantly, they want every man to be able to vote. Sorry, ladies, your moment's going to come in another 140 years or so. But they want all males over the age of 18 to be able to vote, so that way they can have, they realize that they outnumber the wealthy, and they want to have control for the working people of France. At this point, Louis realizes that things are getting pretty hairy. He manages to escape his prison, and he's trying to get away to Belgium. But he's caught. He's caught near the border, and he is returned to Paris. And this really provokes a strong fear amongst the French people, because Louis had been fairly compliant with what was going on at this point. But these guys realize that they're going against not only Louis, but the whole idea of monarchy, or at least of absolutist monarchy. What happens if Louis gets to one of these other European countries where, let's face it, all of them are ruled by Louis' relatives? I mean, Louis' wife is the princess from Austria. That all these people they're all related to one another. And so he shows up and says, hey, I lost my country. If you don't help me get my country back, then your people are going to rebel and they're going to kick you out. This is pretty scary stuff. When left alone, these crown heads will fight amongst themselves when they face revolution from below. The fear is that they'll band together. And what that means is these guys are scared that other foreign armies are going to come in and they're going to start stabbing and shooting. And this is not something that they're going to like. So this is this army of women, and they are on their way to Versailles to grab a hold of Louis, and that's exactly what they're going to do. They got their weapons. They even managed to manhandle, I guess in this case, woman-handle a cannon down. This is the Constitution, the major parts of this, produced by the National Assembly. And I like the way that this little artist has put this together, sort of like the Ten Commandments on the tablets. These guys have this put together. Well, as I mentioned, other European monarchs are not ignorant of what's going on in France. I mean, they get the newspaper in Austria and in Prussia and in Russia and in England and places like that. And so they're very, very worried that the flames of revolution are going to start in France, but they're going to get out of hand and they're going to spread to their backyards as well. So a coalition of nations began gathering, and they began to get ready to attack France. This is something that the French, and you got to remember, their government is very much in a state of flux. They don't have things totally well organized and can handle this. So they're worried about being attacked by 3 or 4 countries at one time. Things are kind of crazy though. The Assembly decides to actually beat these guys to the punch and they declare war on Austria. This seems like a bad idea. That's because it is a bad idea. But the thought process behind this from the point of view of the National Assembly is a war with Austria is going to put aside a lot of our differences. We got the Jacobins fighting against us. You got the royalist people that are fighting against us. We got these bourgeois guys, with these different viewpoints, and there's a lot of chaos. Whereas if we had one enemy, Austria, that would then, okay, we've got to put aside our differences and we've got to focus on fighting an external threat. That was what they hoped would happen. That's not what's going to happen, at least not initially, right? There are continuing riots in Paris. Things are really out of control at this point. In this case now, the Jacobins, particularly these guys, these sans-culottes, right? These are the guys, sans-culotte is actually literal French for without pants. But don't think these guys run around Paris without pants on. Well, it does, I suppose, have a certain appeal to it. These are guys what it means without nice pants. These are guys that are workers. These are factory workers and people that work in the city. This riot is going to push back the forces of the National Assembly, and they're going to capture the king, and they're actually going to lead a coup against the Assembly government. They're going to drive these guys out of power. They're going to institute now a new government that they call the National Convention. Their ideas are not restrict the voting. It is universal male suffrage. Everybody's going to be able to vote, and thus they figure they're going to win. On January 23rd of 1793, the Jacobins take a fateful step, and that is they are going to execute Louis XVI. As I've mentioned before, when you cut a king's head off, you can't uncut it off. Right? At any point up until this, the French people could, say, all right, Louis, we're sorry. Here, sit back on your throne. You get to be king again. Please don't kill us. And probably, there may be some trials of like ringleaders and things like that. But for the most part, the average person that participated in the revolution is probably not going to get hauled up and killed. You can't say you're sorry after you kill the guy. So this is a pretty fateful step, right? But anarchy is going to continue because France's armies are losing a lot of these battles along the frontier to this larger coalition of forces because Austria now has been joined by Prussia, Spain, and Britain in trying to reverse this tide of revolutionary fervor inside of France. And so a lot of people are very worried that their participation in the revolution now, oh man, it's a death sentence. These foreign armies are going to come in and they are going to kill us. So these are the Jacobins they're breaking in. There's Louis in his little holding area inside of Paris. And so, ironically, Louis was already held prisoner. These sans-culotte guys break in and they grab him, and so now he's prisoner to them. And then eventually they are going to execute him. They put him in the guillotine and they would cut his head off. And I like this scene because it just shows you the entire state of chaos of the French Revolution at this point. You can't tell who's on what side. You can't really tell what's going on. There's a great deal of anarchy that's taking place. This is one of these frontier battles. You get the Austrians in the background, and I like this one. If you're clicking through the slides, take a good look at the artist's use of light and dark and the look on the French guys' faces. They all look nervous. The battle itself is this cloud of confusion. They're going forward. They don't really know if they're going to win. Even the officers are going, come on, guys. Let's go get them. They all look kind of deflated and depressed at this point. And this, of course, is having a reverberative effect in France itself because they don't know. They don't know what's going to happen with this, and they're extremely worried about this. Right? So panic is gripping the nation, and ever increasingly there's a great deal of recrimination. There's a lot of finger pointing as to who's to blame over these military defeats. Right? Now the Jacobins managed to hold on to power, which is going to give a little bit of stability. What they're going to do to try to tamp down another counter-revolution, because you got to remember, they've already taken over from one previous revolution. The National Assembly kicked out what was essentially the king's government, and these guys kicked them out. So they're worried that some third group now is going to come along and replace them. So what they're going to do is they're going to form this executive council called the Committee for Public Safety, right? Which was essentially the prevent other revolutions from kicking us out of power committee, right? It would eventually be led by Maximilien Robespierre, and he would eventually become the de facto head of state for France for a while because of the fact that he had the use of force, that he could dominate the committee, and they were the ones that were allowed to use force for whatever means they saw fit. Now the committee is going to call for, to redress these problems of the military, universal mobilization of men. We don't have great armies, we don't have whatever, but we have a lot of people, and we can start sending them towards the front and perhaps we can win by overwhelming our enemies. More importantly, it's going to give it an ideological peg. And that was these people needed to defend the idea of the revolution. They got to defend it. The revolution itself is something that's important. It had been going on by 5 years at this point, and it was something that had to be protected. So this wasn't just some king saying, all right, you guys are in my army now, and you have to fight for me. We're going to go capture this fort in Belgium. Why? Because I want it. I'm the king. Shut up. Okay. Whatever. We're in your army. We got to do it. You don't have a lot of ideological motivation for that. You'll go and you'll fight, trying to get killed. Right? These guys have an ideological motivation. Something important to them. I'm fighting for France. I'm fighting for these ideas. I'm fighting for liberty, equality, brotherhood, whatever, right? It is important. And so when wars take on ideological characters, that's when they really get explosive and out of control. It's not, in many other cases, hey, it's not personal. We're not killing you guys because we hate you. We're just doing it because it's a job, right? But when you get ideology involved, you come in, it's like, we got to deal with these people. You got to wipe them out. You got to knock down buildings. You got to blow up towns. You got to do whatever you got to do because your ideas have to survive. Now, this is going to be a pretty effective policy for the French, right? This idea of mobilizing these people. Essentially, it's the draft. And by 1794, France had an army of 1.16 million men. And they begin winning battles along the frontier. Not only are they now effectively defending France, but in many cases they are driving the enemy backwards. They are actually expanding this, which if you take this and couple it with the idea of ideology, this is a pretty interesting plum that now is in front of these revolutionary French, which is maybe we can take our ideas and advance them elsewhere. This is very much, as I mentioned, a people's army. It's motivated by ideology, and they feel involved in the war's goals, and attacks on civilians are going to increase. Right? This is going to be our most famous general of this period from the French. This is Napoleon, him leading his troops forward. By this point now, the French army has a brand new spirit, has an all-new kind of look to it, and part of Napoleon's success is his ability to understand how that new army works, how to lead it, and how to transform warfare itself. This is one of these Belgian towns that these French forces are now going to occupy as they begin to not only successfully hold the line, but even push that line backward against their enemies. But back in Paris, you have a great deal of problems due to the fact that there's still a lot of political infighting. Well, the Committee for Public Safety decided that one of the best ways to get rid of infighting was to just get rid of these people. They are ideologically motivated, okay? And these people that are opposed to them, they want to bring them in line. Courts are going to be brought in, and people are going to be brought before them, and they are going to be condemned to death for the charge that they have not consistently manifested their attachment to the revolution. You haven't supported the revolution. The revolution is important. The revolution is France. And to go against that is treason. Okay. Now, of course, if you're paying attention to this, if you're really reading this carefully, you've got to ask yourself, wait a minute, what is the revolution? What ideas are the revolution? What ideas are not? If I support a constitutional monarchy, but I still like the idea of freedom, is that the revolution or not? So it's important not only to understand what words these people are using, but who is it determines which dictionary they're going to use to define it. All right? What this means is a lot of people who are political opponents of the Jacobins are going to get the guillotine. All right? They begin these guillotine executions that are going to spiral so out of control that eventually 50,000 Parisians are going to be killed for political opposition to the government in power. The Jacobins are going to use the military to subdue opposition in cities and cannon fire to break up mobs. They're not going to meet these people in anything like a fair fight, right? The mobs come up to you, they want whatever it is they want, the idea of the flavor of the week kind of thing that they want to protest. You just fire in with the cannons, you drive those people away. That's one way to do it. The committee instituted a re-education policy throughout this period of symbolic meaning, symbolic festivals. They were going to control prices. They're going to de-Christianize the state. They're going to shut down the churches. They're going to not allow them to have any authority whatsoever. They even go so far as to introduce a new calendar. It's New France. Everything's starting over. These revolutionaries, these really, really radical ones, see a new age. They called for this renewal of society. They wanted a republic of virtue. which is interesting because they're the same guys that are killing like 50,000 Parisians. And they begin in what they call year one, Stunde Null, right? Where everything before that had started, and then now it's year one. This is year one of the new age, and this is what's going to take place. And of course, this is them, this Republic of Virtue, as these guys are sort of opening fire on the mobs that are attacking the government office. And no, we're not going to allow you guys to protest anymore. We're just going to shoot at you and we're going to kill you. But there's going to be a lot of guillotining, right? A lot of these people are going to get their heads cut off after these sort of kangaroo court trials. And a lot of people turning in, other people, oh, I heard so-and-so. Oh, they didn't consistently manifest their attachment to the revolution. And so a lot of people are going to get done in by personal enemies. These are people that are getting cut to pieces, right? There's another guy that gets his head cut off. And of course, you have funny little moments like this. Men, women, everybody is susceptible to this. And so this is why this period is called the Terror, because people were so afraid. But killing all these people is going to engender a lot of bad feelings. Eventually, what you're going to see is the Committee for Public Safety is going to point this blame back at Robespierre. They say, we killed so many people. People are starting to murmur against us. I don't think we can control all of them. And eventually, Robespierre himself is killed. Ironically, he's guillotined, which I don't know, maybe it's not ironic, maybe it's just punishment. The convention is going to establish a new constitution. I think this is the second one. Don't worry, France is going to have, they're going to get up to something like 17 or 18 constitutions. But the government is still very, very unstable, and the only reason that it really stays in power is because the military, these guys with the guns and the cannons, are able to keep any coup attempt off their backs. Now, we got to back up a little bit and go outside of Paris to understand what also is going on here. Because throughout this period, a young Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte is coming to ever-increasing public prominence due to the fact that he wins a series of stunning victories, especially here in northern victory. Not only is he able to hold the line against Austrian forces moving through northern Italy, but he actually is going to go forward. He's going to capture, fortresses like Mantua and some other places. He's going to win, battles of Marengo. And so Napoleon is going to become incredibly famous. He's a young officer. I think he'd been an artillery officer, and now he's commanding these very large armies. And he's really kicking a lot of butt. Okay? Now, he inspires men personally, because as we mentioned, sort of your personal attachment to the cause is important. He teaches them to move quickly, and so he's going to radically change the art of war in the late 17 and early 1800s, because armies kind of operated on an unspoken set of rules. You move a certain amount of time, you stop, you break camp. Napoleon's like, no, you move as fast as you can. You have a staff that plots out all these different routes. You get, you outflank the enemy, or even if you can cut him off from behind, that would be great. And all of a sudden, Napoleon's armies are kind of everywhere. They're going quickly. They're foraging off the land. They capture a new base to use as a place for supplies, and then they go out and they get another one. They're moving all over the place. It was very, very difficult for old school generals to be able to handle this new kind of Napoleonic system. He taught them to fight ruthlessly, yet very simply, skillfully changed formations. He invented the demi-brigade, where you've got the skirmishers. These guys are kind of like scouts, and sort of light troops that are out in front. You have your main line of troops behind them to provide a base of fire support, and then your most inexperienced troops, you just have them in a column. And then once you kind of worn down the enemy, you just kind of send them in like a battering ram to go to town on these guys, because all you have to do is just sort of point them in one direction. So this is going to be the backbone of a lot of the French system and tactical doctrine for how to fight. Napoleon is going to go a little too far. He's going to try to cut off British interests in the eastern Mediterranean. He's going to invade North Africa, and he's going to do some fighting in Egypt. He's going to go into Egypt and then eventually into southwestern Asia. But he's cut off because of a strategic problem. That is, the British Navy is going to intervene. He's going to win the Battle of Alexandria off the coast of North Africa. The French Navy is going to go to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And now the British Navy stands between the French army and France. Napoleon is still an extremely popular guy. He abandons his army. He manages to get back to Paris. And in 1799, he lends his now political power to a new coup of the government, and he's going to overthrow the Jacobins here in 1799, and he is going to be a part of this. So this very, very shaky National Convention government is going to be swept out of power in 1799, and Napoleon is going to be, well, I say a part of it, but really very, very shortly, he's going to be the government. So there's Robespierre. I like to look on his face. Wait a minute, you guys are making a mistake. I'm supposed to be guillotining other people with this. And then there's Napoleon. We often think of Napoleon as this short little fat guy, and that's the kind of the 1815 end of his career, Napoleon, when he's been emperor for a while and he gets to eat, whatever he wants in France, where of course everything tastes awesome, even snail and rabbit and I don't know, probably rocks. But throughout most of his career, Napoleon was actually pretty svelte, kind of guy. He was in shape. He was a military commander, and you can see his forces are engaging here, but they're also in the background. They're outflanking these Austrian forces by using a mountain pass here in northern Italy. And so there he is. Apparently, Napoleon's chest itched a lot, and so he had to scratch it. Actually, that's not true. That was just the style. That was the pop collar, or the duck face, or whatever, of the late 1700s. This is how you had your portrait painted, was with your hand in your shirt, and so that's that. Here you can see the Battle of Giza, or the Battle of the Pyramids in the background. And so you can see Napoleon's forces taking on the Egyptians in this area. You can see that his men have formed a square, and this is how infantry dealt with cavalry in open spaces. The cannons are at the corners, and then the infantry, they stand like this so that the cavalry can't charge into them, and they fight them off with their bayonets. Right? So the new 1799 government is going to be different than the previous one. It allows for a legislature, so you've got a legislative branch. These guys are going to vote on what the rules are. And it did have an executive, but they were afraid of one person kind of taking power, so they split it up into three. You essentially had three co-presidents. These were called the consuls, right? But of the three, you had a first consul, and the first consul had the real power. Now, big surprise, that's going to be Napoleon, right? Napoleon's power is only going to increase over time until eventually he becomes the only guy who really is the important person in the government, and then eventually he'll be the emperor. He'll be the only guy in the government, except for people that he delegates. So using this little bit of political power, though, Napoleon, he was a reform-minded person. He was very much, had the ideas of the revolution in his head, and he's going to make some changes. He reinstitutes the Catholic Church. He says that Christianity, religion is fundamental to people. We can't just get rid of all that, all right? But he says they don't get the political power that they've had before. So people, when they go back to church, they can do their bit with their religion, all right? But they retain state control over the church. Okay? The church is going to operate within our country, and it's, it has to do, what's legal, and it can't just take over the way that it might want to. He's going to refine the civil code of laws with the ideas of equality before the law, toleration of other religions, the abolition of feudal rights. Just because you're born to whatever doesn't mean that you get to govern society. You can keep your titles if you want, right? You can still call yourself the Marquis, whatever. But you don't actually have a political authority. And also property protections, the idea that whatever is yours, you own it, and you can use it as you see fit, right? The bureaucracy is going to become a lot more centralized, with the local leaders being appointed by Napoleon himself. France also is going to introduce, and this is one that's going to stick, is the metric system. If you're interested in France's body of law under the Napoleonic era and these changes that he makes in the civil code, just go and study to be a lawyer in Louisiana. Louisiana was still under Napoleon's code when it was brought into the United States by President Thomas Jefferson. And so all they did was they had the Napoleonic Code, and that then became the basis for eventually the state of Louisiana's state law. So 49 of the 50 states in the United States all look basically like sort of a transported English law, except for Louisiana, which was the Napoleonic Code. So it's very, very different in terms of how it's laid out. So if you're interested, go study law in Louisiana, just so this little point of trivia will make more sense to you. I'm just kidding, except for all you pre-Louisiana lawyers out there, right? Here we go. By 1802, Napoleon had done a number on much of Europe's armies, and really had extended France's control to the Rhine River through northern Italy, and was an extremely dominant position. There's going to be a brief little break in the fighting that's going to take place. It was called the Peace of Amiens. You can think of it sort of like halftime at a football game, where these guys, they kind of go in the locker room and they take a little breather, but you know that they're just going to come back and go at it again. And that's exactly what's going to take place here in 1803. The peace is going to break down. France and England are going to go back to war, and then this coalition against France is going to start fighting again. In 1804, Napoleon takes this very fateful step, and he's going to crown himself emperor. He's going to proclaim himself the emperor, right? You've got a renewed war, and Napoleon is going to go on the offensive, and he's actually going to crush this new alliance between 1805 and 1807. Now, the major year for military action is going to be in 1805, right? the major victory, the major battle here is going to be at a place called Austerlitz, right? Napoleon is going to take on a much larger, but much more disorganized coalition of Russian and Austrian troops, right? To give you an idea, to kind of diagram this out for you, Napoleon's going to do his normal kind of thing. He's going to keep pretty tight rein on his forces, husbanding them for an eventual counterstroke. Because as the situation is going to change, he sends out staff orders and riders and things like that, continues pulling back his lines. He's being attacked by a much larger force until eventually he sees an opportunity, right? His men are going to push back the Russian part, the center of the line, and then he's going to send in this counterattack to expand it. That's going to snap the line, and then the Allies are going to break, because instead of one big army, there are now two smaller armies as a result of this action. The Allies are going to break and flee, and we're going to see that Napoleon is going to rush troops through this gap and is going to rout the entire enemy army. His cavalry is going to circle around behind. He's going to catch and cut down a lot of these people. All right. The battle is going to allow Napoleon to dominate continental Europe. Nobody's going to have the guts to stand up to Napoleon for another 7 years as a result of this bad beatdown. So here you can see this. It was fought late in the year in 1805, and Napoleon's forces are up here. Napoleon himself has got control of the situation from one of these hills. He's watching this situation. A lot of people are very nervous because they're outmanned. Napoleon knows what he's doing. He's pulling his forces back. He's kind of keeping them together. He's doing the fighting with this. This little battle diagram gives you a good idea. Napoleon's got what you call interior lines of communication. He's on the inside of the curve, whereas these guys are on the outside of the curve, until eventually this is where the situation is going to get bad. And when you see, this is where they break. They break in the center. Bernard's troops and Murat's cavalry are going to break through with this, until eventually you got the two wings that are going to eventually have to fall back as well. All right. Now, Napoleon's major problem with all of this is Britain, because you can't march an army from France to Britain. You've got somebody put the Atlantic Ocean in the way, so the English Channel. So his plan had long been to invade Britain, but in order to be able to do that, you've got to have naval dominance. You at least have to have enough naval control of the Channel for the period of time it would take to get the army from France to Britain. All right? And so France had been building up its fleet in order to be able to do that, because the British Navy is par excellence, right? They have the best Navy in the world. They're going to enlist the aid of the Spanish, and eventually this is all going to come to a head at the Battle of Trafalgar, and because of the outcome, we're going to see that France's Navy just isn't going to ever make that invasion of England possible. All right? What you got in the battle is a combination of a French and Spanish fleet. And they've been gathering here, at least in part, to be the invasion force, but they were attacked by Lord Nelson's British fleet off the coast of Spain. This is the largest naval battle in the Napoleonic period. It's also the largest battle period of the age of sail, before ships were made of metal and used internal combustion to drive them. And what's going to happen here is Nelson is going to form his flotilla, his fleet, into two columns. They're going to break the French and Spanish lines, and it's going to become this general melee that, of course, the British are much better at fighting. And so, long story short, the British they're going to smash the French fleet, and they're going to assume hegemonic dominance of the waves all around Europe and essentially around the world. So, Napoleon is unable to defeat the British through conventional means. I mean, up until this point, if somebody stood with Napoleon, he'd march an army in and just, pound him. You can't do that with Britain. Britain also, for its part, can't really do a lot of combat with Napoleon because, yeah, their navy is great, but their army is still kind of coming along as a result of that. So what you're going to see is these guys have got to find, these two combatants have got to find a way to get at one another, because they can't normally, their strongest part of their military doesn't directly engage themselves. Napoleon realizes that he can't use direct military action. He can use some other method. In this case, it's going to be economic action. He institutes what he calls the continental system in order to try to cut off supplies to Britain from the other countries that he controls around Europe. He's particularly interested in cutting off the flow of goods to Britons that they can use for their navy. Now, these countries, they really resented French economic control. You can imagine somebody else is going to come in there and go, you guys can't trade with these guys and make money. But I really like making money. Right? So they don't like this. They also don't like the French that are coming in and making a number of changes to their government. Now, of course, the French are instituting what they think are the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of the French Revolution. But anytime anybody comes into your house and kicks you around and tells you this is what you got to do, you never tell yourself, well, actually, these ideas are pretty good. You say, no, somebody's coming in and they're telling you what to do, right? They begin to resist this on what eventually you and I would refer to as nationalism. These nationalist feelings of, we're group A and these guys are group B. It doesn't matter what they have to say. We don't particularly want to listen to them, right? So here's the diagram. This is Trafalgar, right? This is the guys as they're going in here in this double column attack. The leads of the two columns of Collingwood and Nelson himself. Nelson's in the victory, and they break this semicircular line of the Franco-Spanish fleet with a pretty epic series of battles. And this is what it would have looked like. These ships are sort of laying off one side to another and blowing each other away with cannon fire until eventually the whole battle becomes this confusing sort of forest of mass of ships. And just as victory is assured, Nelson himself is gunned down by what you and I refer to as a kind of sniper, a marine in the rigging of an enemy ship, and so he becomes a martyr for this cause. And so if you go to London today, you can go to Trafalgar Square, where Lord Nelson's statue is figured prominently, and that's why, because essentially the British regard him as one of the great saviors of their country. That just as they're about to be invaded, he defeats the French fleet, and that saves them. Right? Well, these other countries, they really chafe under the idea of the fact that they've got to do what Napoleon's French government is telling them to do. And so finally, Russia is going to be the first of these to openly challenge French power. They pull themselves out of the continental system in 1812. This is going to force Napoleon's hand. Because if he does nothing, other nations are going to say, Russia took on Napoleon and nothing happened to them. Maybe we can take on Napoleon too. So Napoleon realizes he's going to have to go in and he's going to have to smack the Russians around so that he can establish the fact that he still has a great deal of authority. Napoleon is going to gather a massive army together for the invasion of Russia, and he's going to start off here with this grand army of 600,000 men. He's going to start from what is now Poland and march himself east into Russia. The Russians themselves understand, though, that one of the great assets they have is they got a great deal of real estate. And their overall strategy is to trade space for time. The further that Napoleon has to march into their country, the weaker he's going to get. Guys are going to get sick, guys are going to die in battle, guys are going to have to be detailed off from his army to guard the roads behind him so that way he's continuing to get supplies. And of course, the supply lines are going to get longer and longer, and it's going to get harder and harder for him to get food and ammunition and reinforcements to the front. So what they typically would do was, as Napoleon's army would march forward, they'd go up, they'd fight a little bit, and then Napoleon would stop, and have to deploy his forces, and then before they could actually fight a big battle where they might get destroyed by the fact that Napoleon, let's face it, is a pretty awesome general, they would then simply pull back to the next position. And then that's a whole bunch of lost, wasted time on the part of the French. So they would fight these inconclusive delaying battles. By late 1812, they do fight a big battle of Borodino, which is an inconclusive kind of affair. At the end of the day, you do have French forces kind of pushing the Russians out of the way, but the Russian army is not completely destroyed. And so by the winter of 1812, Napoleon captures Moscow, but the Russians simply retreat further back. And it's getting really, really cold. The Russians actually had booby-trapped Moscow. They had set explosives and fire traps all throughout the city, and the city burns. And so Napoleon, he's never really lost a battle. The Russians haven't beaten him at any point, but now he's forced to retreat because you can't just leave your army here in the frozen wastes of Russia with no ability to sustain themselves. He's harassed constantly now by the winter weather. You got snow, you got cold, you got sleet, you got ice. And of course, you now have the Russian cavalry, these hussars, who are kind of on the fringes of his army, picking off stragglers and catching these guys here and there, and just constantly harassing them. And of course, his army is getting weaker and weaker and smaller, until eventually they do manage to get back into Poland, where they had started from, but of the 600,000 that Napoleon had left with, only 40,000 French troops are going to survive the campaign. What happened as a result of that is a general revolt all around Europe, because now it's proven Napoleon's not invincible. He hasn't lost a battle yet. They haven't crushed him. They haven't defeated him. But it's clear that not everything that he touches turns to gold. as a result of that. So here's the Battle of Borodino. These are the hills along the river that the Russians had sort of fortified. Eventually, French forces would break through these fortifications and kind of push on, but not in such a vigorous manner that the Russian army is destroyed. And these are French troops on the retreat. They are in the cold, they're in the snow, and they're ever increasingly, disease and the fatigue of the campaign is getting them until only a handful of them, a small fraction, are going to survive these icy river crossings to get back into their bases in Poland. So these uprisings and incursions all around Europe is forcing Napoleon to retreat westward back towards France. He is finally defeated at a Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and now it is looking increasingly like Napoleon is in fact going to be resoundingly defeated. You have Russia, Prussia, and Austria begin invading France from the east in 1814, while Britain, which had landed its army in Spain to help the Spanish drive out French forces that had been occupying them since 1812, are now moving into France from the south. Napoleon is deposed. Alliance forces reach Paris. They're able to remove him from power. He is sent to exile in the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. So everything begins to calm down because, oh, well, this is great. We've gotten rid of Napoleon. We can now restore the rightful French monarchy. The problem with this is Napoleon goes to Elba and he gets bored. He's got nothing to do. Being the emperor was pretty cool. He had all these armies. He had all this cool stuff that you can do. And being the emperor of Elba just isn't going to quite cut it. Plus, in 1815, there's nothing on TV. So, you got to do something with your time. He slips away from Elba and he returns to the south of France. And he proclaims that he's going to be taken over. The army officers that had served with Napoleon were granted an amnesty, essentially, by the French monarchy. The Bourbon family comes in and says, okay, we understood that you were serving Napoleon. As far as we're concerned, you thought he was the legitimate government. Just swear an oath of allegiance to us, and sort of all will be forgiven. So they do this. One of these marshals under Napoleon, Ney, he's sent down to the south of France with a column of troops. Okay, we got to apprehend Napoleon. He shouldn't be here. We got to arrest him. When they arrive, Napoleon's wearing this sort of civilian overcoat, and when they go and they surround him, he takes it off, and under it is his army uniform. He says, "Your emperor has returned." Vive l'Empereur! They all join Napoleon. They all head back towards Paris. He retakes power, and because he now has the army on his side, and they all come back on his side. Great, right? So you now have a huge scare. Now Napoleon understands the Allies aren't just going to sit back and, hey, we fought this giant war with you, and we kicked you out of power. Oh, you're back? Yeah, all right, cool. That's fine. We weren't really serious about the whole we want to defeat you thing anyway. No, but he understands that if he can strike back at the Allies and drive them out of the area while they're still scattered and unprepared, then he can consolidate his authority, and then he'll hopefully be unassailable. He's going to fight a couple of battles where he's going to win against Alliance forces at Ligny and Quatre Bras, but he's going to run into a main enemy army that had been gathering at a place called Waterloo of British and Prussian forces, where he's going to be dealing with these guys. This is going to be a titanic struggle. The British are going to hold firm along a ridge line, while the Prussians eventually going to arrive from their beating at the previous battles on the flank, just as the British forces are holding. The Imperial Guard is sent forward, and these guys not only are forced to stop, but they are eventually forced backwards by the British. The British are using reverse slope tactics. These guys come up and over, and they're going to go toe-to-toe with France's best soldiers under Napoleon, and they're going to win. They're going to drive these guys backwards, and just right at the moment where the French army is in a state of confusion, are they going to be able to attack again? Are they going to be able to move forward? The Prussians under Blucher attack the right flank of Napoleon's army, and it proves that not only that attack, but the timing of that attack is going to be crucial in throwing the entire French army into disarray. Napoleon's forces break, they rout, French forces scatter. Napoleon is then captured again, and he's sent into permanent, this time, exile much further away, the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where it's not going to be easy for him to get back to France. He would eventually die there of stomach cancer, at least ostensibly stomach cancer, and never bother anybody again. Right? This is Waterloo. This is where this fighting is going to take place. Right? La Haye Sainte and this ridge line that takes place here with Hougomont Farm. on the southern end of the southern spur of the ridge line. And these are the British forces that are going to hold this against these assaults by the French. And then, of course, late in the day, this is where Blucher's Prussians, these German guys, are going to come in and eventually outflank much of the French army. And I end this with this description, or with this picture, which really gives a good description of kind of Europe and much of the world that have been wrapped up in this fighting that had been taking place. Where you got this is the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo. You got a lot of dead bodies, you got dead horses, you got burned buildings, you got a lot of chaos, you got a lot of destruction. I like how the artists threw in these sort of rumblings of these thunderclouds. So this is the French Revolution. This is what's happened here. And the next time we'll get together, we'll talk about sort of bigger things, social things that are taking place in the wake of all of these big ideas.